Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on the climate investments in the California Blueprint from today's announced May revise from Governor Gavin Newsom. We'll be joined today by California Secretary of Natural Resources, Wade Crowfoot, California Environmental Protection Agency Secretary, Jared Blumenfeld, and California Governor's Senior Advisor for Climate, Lauren Sanchez. Today's webinar will be recorded. We will also take questions in the Q&A box. Please feel free to submit any questions and we'll try to get to as many as possible today. If you have any questions about this webinar following, please feel free to visit our website at California Natural Resources. And we'll also provide the recordings for the webinar and fact sheets for today's announcements on that same webpage. Thank you again for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Lauren Sanchez.
Thanks so much, Andrea. Muy buenas tardes. Thank you all for joining this afternoon. As Andrea mentioned, I'm Lauren Sanchez, the Governor's Senior Climate Advisor. And I really want to start by thanking our entire climate cabinet here across the Newsom team and Kaylee Bossler, our beloved outgoing finance director, and their whole teams for their close partnership on the climate budget. Earlier this year, the governor unveiled a $37 billion multi-year climate budget that builds on the state's climate leadership to do three things: protect Californians from the extreme effects of wildfire, drought, and heat, lead the world in reducing carbon pollution, and build more prosperous and sustainable communities for all. But we know that when it comes to climate change, there's too much talk and too little action. California is the epicenter of the climate crisis, and we need to meet the moment with the urgency it requires. So today we are redoubling our efforts, proposing an additional $9.5 billion in climate spending and committing to the most robust, comprehensive climate budget in the state's history, the California Climate Commitment. The climate budget is so important at this time in our history as a state, as a nation, and as a planet, because later is too late. My generation, most Californians are worried, fearful, anxious because too many aren't treating climate change with the seriousness it deserves. But California is different. The climate commitment builds on the governor's January proposal, which included $10 billion for zero-emission vehicles, $1 billion for equitable building decarbonization, $9 billion for accessible transit, $1 billion for climate smart housing, billions to build climate resilience, investments in jobs and education and health and so much more. But we also know that the world has radically changed since January. A record-breaking lack of precipitation pushed us into a more severe drought. Climate change, geopolitical crises, supply chain and regulatory issues have fundamentally changed our energy reliability outlook. And as you heard the governor emphasize this morning, Californians continue to suffer from high gas prices and high utility bills. That is why we're proposing additional investments to address immediate drought needs, ensure energy reliability and affordability, and to continue leading the world in climate innovation. We are helping Californians today while paving the way to a resilient future. In the governor's $18 billion relief package, he re-emphasized a commitment to accelerate all of our zero-emission vehicle investments, specifically our funding for equitable charging infrastructure and our equity-focused clean vehicle programs, to provide 3 months of free public transit, and proposed an additional $500 million for active transportation projects across the state. Today, as part of that relief package, the governor also proposed $1.4 billion to help Californians pay their electricity and water utility bills. Taken together, the California Climate Commitment will deliver community resilience, deploy clean and reliable energy, and expand access to climate jobs and education while fundamentally changing how we power the world's 5th largest economy. This budget articulates a future, a state that all Californians can see themselves in. And we designed this budget with equity at its core. It wasn't an afterthought, it was baked in from the beginning. There's a lot more in the climate commitment to be excited about, and I'm joined by Secretaries Blumenfeld and Crowfoot and our partner Matt Almy from the Department of Finance to share details with you today. And with that, let me introduce my partner in this effort, Natural Resources Secretary Wade Crowfoot. Over to you, Wade.
Hey, thanks so much, Lauren, for all your work quarterbacking the budget, both the governor's proposed budget in January and then what we know as the May revision, which is an adjustment to our proposed budget that the governor outlined today that he and the governor's office will be discussing with the legislature over the next couple of months. So it's our goal to detail a little bit more on what Lauren overviewed, which are some key components of the climate budget in this May revision. And I'll take a crack at summarizing our news on energy, on what we call nature-based solutions, and wildfire, and then turn it over to my colleague, Jared Blumenfeld. I will note that Andrea, our colleague, has put in the chat a link to the full e-budget that was released today, and that includes the so-called A pages, which are a written explanation of the climate budget, so you can refer to that here. I'll also just repeat that we have briefings later this afternoon, both on energy and on water. So while we'll overview each of those other briefings with some of our departmental leaders will be a good opportunity to deep dive and to ask specific questions on those topics. So on energy, this May package adds over $8 billion for a variety of solutions to help ensure the reliability of energy amidst accelerating climate change, and also allows us to transition as quickly as possible to our clean energy future. Now, many of us know that California continues to face increased impacts of climate change, including those that impact our energy system. Regional heat waves, or what we know as extreme heat, requires us to cool buildings and keep people safe in those hot months, increasing summer energy demand and putting unprecedented stress on our electricity grid. Our drought that we're currently in is lowering the ability to provide electricity production through hydroelectricity in the dams, so that impacts our energy system. And of course, catastrophic wildfires driven by climate change threaten the availability of our energy surging through our transmission lines. So in the past and in recent months, we've taken certain actions to address these challenges. An unprecedented procurement of battery storage, delaying planned retirement of power plants and other power providing units, emergency generation, and importantly, accelerating projects. So this May budget revision includes an additional $5.2 billion for what we're calling the Strategic Electricity Reliability Reserve, which is essentially a title to talk about the resources that will be able to provide up to 5,000 megawatts for our electricity grid when it's stressed. We're also proposing to provide $295 million of additional incentives to reduce energy demand during peak energy times. So while we're focused on reliability, given these accelerating climate impacts, we're obviously focused on accelerating our transition toward a clean energy grid. And we're proud to be a world leader in this area. Given climate change, we need to move even more quickly and accelerate our actions to transition towards a fully clean energy system. And included in the May budget that the governor just announced toward this end is $970 million to incentivize installation of solar and storage systems on homes and buildings, much of which will be focused on low-income households. Also proposing an additional $250 million for leveraging additional financing tools to support the development of clean energy projects, including transmission lines. Now, look, we understand that this transition towards clean energy has to be done in a way that prioritizes equity and affordability, as well as economic growth. And we also recognize this has been a challenging time for Americans and Californians to continue to pay bills through the pandemic. So this May revision includes an additional $1.2 billion to help pay down energy bills. So we're really proud of the governor's proposed budget, both in January and what is added here in the May revision, and look forward to discussions with the legislature in this space. We are also increasing funding over the last year or two on nature-based solutions. So this is everything from improving forest health, restoring wetlands, cooling communities, accessing, or I should say, scaling up climate-smart agriculture. These are efforts to really center nature in our fight against climate change and our adaptation to climate change, and protecting biodiversity and improving equitable outdoor access. You may know that last month in April, we released two final strategies that are really driving us forward on a nature-based solutions agenda. Our Pathways to 30 by 30, which is our strategy to conserve 30% of our lands and coastal waters by 2030, and the first ever climate smart land strategy, which we know as our natural and working lands climate smart strategy. Last year, the governor and legislature came together and identified $678 million for nature-based solutions to be spent here in coming months and years. But because those strategies weren't completed, essentially that funding was set aside, and the governor's office was directed or asked to propose the use of those funding by May revision. Some of you may know last month we laid out how we would propose to spend this $678 million on nature-based solutions to implement 30 by 30 and climate smart lands. And I'll just briefly mention key categories of funding that we're proposing for this nature-based solutions pot. $375 million for programs that help implement those strategies, including $245 million for planning, acquisition, restoration projects on our lands, $90 million to accelerate restorations of inland wetlands, $20 million to reduce reliance on groundwater, and a few other pieces. So all about actually getting projects on the ground to deploy nature-based solutions on climate change and these other challenges. Another key bucket is $231 million to support regional leadership. We know that these nature-based solutions, environmental conservation happens regionally. So we need to get funds into regions, into projects, and help build capacity of regional groups to deliver these projects, including funding into a really promising local planning process called the NCCP program, or Natural Community Conservation Planning Program, where counties identify areas of land that they want to conserve and areas that are appropriate for housing and energy development. So this category of funding is all about supporting that regional, that local planning and execution of projects. We're also really excited that another bucket is funding expanding economic opportunities for young leaders to get into this work, and specifically funding our California Conservation Corps to build out the number of spaces they have for young people to do this work. Part of this funding will launch a tribal solutions corps, in other words, a tribal conservation corps, which we are really excited about and as part of this proposal. And then, of course, we were really excited to also announce last month that we're proposing that $100 million out of this nature-based solutions pot of funding be focused on partnering with California Native American tribes, specifically focused on transferring funding to tribal governments and tribal communities to advance nature-based solution initiatives. And that can include co-management of our resources, ancestral tribal land return, many other efforts, all focused on empowering and resourcing tribes to do this. We're also in this May revise proposing an important amount of money, $18 million in one-time general fund, to take the first step in transforming the state's capacity to track the effects in real time of accelerating climate change, and then to help us make science-based decisions for how we invest in climate adaptation and resilience. We're calling this the California CIS, or the California Climate Information System, and it will process, integrate, analyze the most current climate and environmental data from satellites that are currently orbiting our planet, remote sensing technology that are accessed via our partnership with NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or NASA JPL. If this funding is approved and we're able to stand up CalCIS, we think this will be an international model that will inform our decision-making, our investments, your investments as leaders and groups, and allow us to track changes in real time to our landscapes. And our goal is that this platform, CalCIS, would be publicly available for everybody's use. I'll transition now to wildfires. And you probably know that the legislature, the governor have agreed over the last year to spend a historic amount of funding, not only responding to catastrophic wildfires, but taking upfront proactive actions to reduce the risks of fire becoming large and dangerous. And in fact, this totals $3.6 billion over the last 2 years. $1.5 billion in the last year's budget, almost $1.8 million in January, and then an additional $233 million proposed in this May revise. I'm really excited that those resources that the legislature, the governor allocated last year are already being put to use. And in less than a year, funding approved in this current budget year has launched over 550 new projects throughout the state. And that's the funding from that emergency allocation last April, and then the tranche approved in September. And this is a team effort. Not only is CAL FIRE involved, 21 departments or agencies across the state implementing 40 wildfire resilience programs with all sorts of really good examples of where these projects are actually making a difference, protecting communities and natural places. So in this May budget, we've called for an additional $233 million, focused one on enhancing our CAL FIRE surge capacity for the 2022 fire season. We know conditions are rough and we're staring down the barrel of another dangerous wildfire season, just given drought conditions. So the May revision includes $83 million in one-time funding to augment CAL FIRE's resources, specifically to staff 16 additional firefighter crews, provide for chainsaw operators through our California Military Department, and provide resources to our California Conservation Corps. Our May revise also in the wildfire space calls for an additional $150 million and 465 positions at CAL FIRE to enhance CAL FIRE's capacity to meet the demands of increased wildland firefighting. So it's very much a combination of continuing to strengthen our response to wildfires through CAL FIRE and then scaling up our proactive actions upfront to build our wildfire resilience. Lastly, I'll mention before I turn it over to my colleague, I'm really excited with some investments focused on expanding equitable access to the outdoors, which I'll lump in here with our climate budget, including $15 million for a first ever partnership between our State Parks Department and our California African American Museum to better incorporate African American history into our state parks. $15 million of proposed funding to augment outdoor education in our state parks, where school kids can come in and use our state parks to be outside and learn. An additional $13 million proposed to expand on the very popular Library Pass program that we've just started piloting, where folks can go and check out a local state parks pass in their library. And then lastly, $5 million to pursue what we hope to be our newest state park in over a decade, Dos Rios Ranch Preserve, which is located at the confluence of the Tuolumne and the San Joaquin River, which provides great ecological benefit for floodplain, for fish and wildlife, but we think remarkable recreational benefits for folks in the northern San Joaquin Valley. So a lot to digest there, but really excited to share with you some highlights. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Jared Blumenfeld, who leads our sister environmental agency, the California Environmental Protection Agency. Jared.
Thanks, Wade. That really was a tour de force. And thank you, Lauren, for your leadership in putting together this historic climate commitment budget. Really, really appreciate both of you and all the teams and everyone watching today. As we said in Jan 10, it takes a village. Want to really appreciate all the work you do day in, day out, whether it's at the community scale, working in governor's office, working in cities or counties, or working for innovative businesses or universities. You're all making this happen. And to just kind of riff on the governor and Lauren and Wade, I mean, it really is humbling to have this opportunity to have a $100 billion surplus, the largest in the state's history, and really an opportunity to make sure the communities that need the help the most get it quickly. Really like Lauren's frame of, enough talking, we need to do some clear actions. And that's what I think California has always stood for, and why I'm proud to work on this team. And in particular, this $47 billion budget exemplifies the governor's determination really to turn the corner on the climate crisis while advancing, as Lauren mentioned, equity and ensuring that Californians struggling with the affordability crisis get the support they need. I want to talk briefly about water issues and drought included in the May revision. Before I do that, it's kind of odd that for decades, water has been an issue, drought has been an issue, climate has been an issue. I really appreciate that this administration is kind of bringing those together. The drought and water issues that California is facing right now are 100% climate issues. So you don't need to be a meteorologist to notice that January, February, and March of this year were the driest on record, dating back 100 years, with just 6 inches of precipitation observed across the Sierra Nevada. All of California's 58 counties are currently under a drought emergency. That's why at the end of March, the governor issued an executive order to continue to drive conservation at the local level, including calling on local water suppliers to take more aggressive conservation actions, and directing the state board to consider, which they're doing today, adoption of a definition of a non-functional turf and a ban on watering of decorative grass at businesses and public institutions. The May revise reflects the administration's focus on making California more drought resilient in the future while managing through current weather extremes caused by climate change. This includes investments to support local and regional agencies as they manage through weather extremes, ensuring all Californians have safe and affordable drinking water, maximizing conservation efforts, protecting fish and wildlife, supporting climate smart agricultural practices that bolster the state's farm economy. In addition, the 2021 budget allocated $5.2 billion as a 3-year investment in drought response and water resilience. This May revision allocates an additional $1.6 billion. The numbers are kind of just dizzying in their magnitude. And our goal is to make sure that we also have contingency. So we put $250 million aside as a contingency in the budget for a total of $2 billion. Those $2 billion in the May revise include $530 million to support drinking water and water supply reliability, including $100 million for water recycling and $400 million for water infrastructure that will leverage federal infrastructure dollars. $553 million for immediate drought response, including $100 million for the Save Our Water campaign, and 180 million for urban and smaller community suppliers for drought relief, 280 to address fish and wildlife impacts associated with the drought and climate change, and to build aquatic habitat and water resilience projects. This includes 100 million to protect salmon, which experience impact from the changes in river temperature, and 15 million to improve drought resilience on state lands. Finally, in this area, there's 187 million to support conservation and water efficiency in agriculture and to provide drought relief for small farmers. Let me also briefly touch on a couple of new proposals in the May revision related to reducing harmful climate and air pollution threatening our communities. First, I want to remind everyone that these additional elements build on the historic climate budget the governor laid out in January. Included in that budget is 10 billion for zero emission mobility proposals that will fundamentally change how Californians move about the state. That package includes deep emphasis on equity through a focus, as Lauren mentioned, on zero emission heavy duty fleets. The 10 billion over 6 years would include 5 billion for heavy duty vehicles and associated charging, billion for passenger vehicle rebates and low income ZEV access, and $1 billion for passenger vehicle charging, fueling infrastructure. And then importantly, as it relates to moving things around the state and cleaning up ports, 400 million for port electrification. As Lauren mentioned, some of this would happen sooner in the 6-year period than originally anticipated through the inflation relief package articulated by the governor today. The budget also includes over 9 billion for clean transportation options such as high-speed rail, and I saw a question, includes e-bikes even, among billions in additional climate investments. New in the May revision as part of the cap and trade expenditure plan are 2 proposals I'm particularly excited about. The first kind of segues with what Wade was talking about in terms of using GIS and satellite data. It's a $100 million proposal for methane accountability and monitoring. We all know methane abatement is our best bet for slowing climate warming in the near term. And California has already demonstrated our leadership in this space through our efforts to reduce methane emissions from waste and dairy sectors. This new proposal allows California to take our leadership literally to the next level. Through the program, California would partner with the private sector, NGOs, and other governments to use satellites to identify where the most egregious methane leaks are coming from, leaks that are destroying our climate and polluting our communities. California would then use this information to target enforcement action against polluters. In addition, the May revision includes an additional 20 million for the AB 617 Community Protection Program, CARB's flagship environmental justice initiative. The community-driven program builds and reduces emissions in neighborhoods with disproportionate exposure to air pollution through targeted air monitoring and community emissions reduction programs. This additional 20 million is coupled with the 240 million announced in January to support AB 617 investments. Really appreciate the opportunity to present on these important programs. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Lauren Sanchez.
Thanks so much, Jared. So we've discussed wildfire and drought, but I want to spend a minute talking about the administration's plan to protect Californians from extreme heat as we prepare for another spring heat wave this weekend. The best available climate science projects extreme heat will impact every corner of the state, posing risks to every region and every sector. It also poses profoundly disproportionate consequences for the most vulnerable among us. Last year, California experienced the hottest summer on record, with Death Valley setting an unfortunate world record for the hottest measured temperature in history, hitting 130 degrees in July. And Fresno saw over 60 days above 100 degrees. Last month, the administration unveiled our commitment to action, California's Extreme Heat Action Plan. It outlines California's all-of-government approach to mitigating the health, economic, cultural, ecological, and social impacts of increasing temperatures and heat waves. The actions included in the plan were developed and refined by over 50 state entities and through extensive public input and engagement. Last year, we agreed with the legislature to dedicate $800 million to protect communities from extreme heat. The climate budget includes details for how we will spend the $300 million we had set aside to specifically implement the action plan. That includes $220 million to accelerate readiness and protect communities most impacted by extreme heat, including through cooling schools, supporting community resilience centers, and expanding nature-based solutions. It also includes $43 million to protect vulnerable populations and ecosystems from extreme heat risks, including expanding targeted outreach and enforcement efforts to protect workers, and education and training at healthcare and childcare facilities. $20 million to increase public awareness to reduce risks posed by extreme heat. So we'll fund a public campaign that will include developing tailored awareness materials and working in partnership with community-based organizations and media specializing in language and culturally competent content. And lastly, $17 million to expand economic opportunity and build a climate-smart workforce that can operate under and address extreme heat. And as the governor highlighted today, California is leaning into investments that will continue our track record of leading the world on climate innovation, whether it's Wade's agency's GIS and satellite data or Jared's agency's methane satellites. The governor is proposing $1 billion for grants to companies that are headquartered here in California with a focus on developing and commercializing new technologies that will help us achieve our climate goals. This proposal would fund a portfolio of technology breakthroughs to our climate challenge, including tech related to zero-emission transportation and mobility, offshore wind, wildfire prevention, and so much more. And finally, the May revision proposes an unprecedented amount of support to advance the governor's Lithium Valley vision, as you heard him emphasize when he closed the budget presentation this morning. The funding includes $5 million to support planning and community engagement in Imperial County related to geothermal development and lithium extraction, $45 million for tax incentives, and $80 million to expand training at the San Diego State University Brawley Center in the Imperial Valley in our higher education package. The proposal also advances a major community priority by providing for local governments and residents to benefit from the development and extraction of lithium by establishing a tax per ton of lithium extracted, placing reporting and fee requirements on extraction activities, and providing funds to contribute to the maintenance, operations, and restoration of the Salton Sea. As you heard from the governor this morning, the opportunity we are building with community, local government, and industry partners at the Salton Sea is deeply humbling. We look forward to continued engagement with all of our partners to implement this bold vision. Taken together, this budget fundamentally gives me hope. Working with all of you on this budget inspires a brighter future for all Californians. Thank you for your time, for your engagement, and we look forward to continued collaboration with you all and our partners in the legislature. Back to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Lauren and Secretaries Blumenfeld and Crowfoot. We welcome questions submitted into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to as many as possible today. I'll invite Secretaries Crowfoot and Blumenfeld for any particular questions that may come up. I'm happy to take that first one and drive it over to our reference to today's additional briefings at 3 p.m. shortly. We have one briefing at 3 p.m. for water investments in the governor's budget and a second briefing for energy investments in the governor's budget also at 3 p.m. For more information and to register for both of those, you can go to our website. We'll add the link into the chat one more time. So for any energy questions and for water questions, please feel free to join some of the briefings that we'll have later for a deeper dive. We will try to get to a few of them today. Our next question is around the California Adaptation Plan. And perhaps I'll ask Secretary Crowfoot to join us if he's available. There's a question in particular around accelerating climate smart land strategies and then also around the Climate Adaptation Plan.
Yeah, thanks. So it's important to share that we updated our state's adaptation plan earlier this year. And by state law passed by the legislature, we need to update this plan periodically. And the adaptation plan in the past has been a little bit more of sort of a written plan that is a document. We shifted that in partnership, our agency in partnership with the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, really focused on it being, first of all, a living website that tracks our key priorities to adapt to climate change. It also outlines 6 guiding priorities from, prioritize public health protection to prioritize the most vulnerable communities to climate change. So in any event, that adaptation plan is really setting sort of the North Star for all of our work, whether that's in water or wildfire or on extreme heat. So I'll ask Andrea, if she can, to put a link to that adaptation plan in the chat. So I think there's a question about one of the items in that, which is programs and actions to accelerate climate smart land management practices. And I wonder if my colleague Amanda Hansen is on the Zoom, who can join us to specifically answer that question around what's envisioned for that $30 million to accelerate climate smart land management practices across California's diverse landscapes. And yeah, over to you.
I am here. Thanks, Wade. Yes, I'm happy to answer the question. Fundamentally, we understand, as we've engaged folks across California who are interested in building more climate smart practices into the way that they manage lands, that support for technical assistance and for capacity building in order to build those practices in is critical. And because there are a diverse suite of land managers out there, and because there are a diverse suite of landscapes in our beautiful California, it's really critical that we inject a significant amount of funding to support that technical assistance wherever it is needed. And so those funds are really intended to drive faster action in California and to support additional partners, people who want to join us in driving climate action through land management.
Thanks so much, Amanda.
Thank you, Secretary Crowfoot and Amanda. We have another question that we'd like to direct toward our colleague over at the Department of Finance, Matt Almy. There's a question specifically, Matt, around the cap and trade revenue and if that's its funding part of the May revise. Perhaps you can address that.
Yes, thank you. So the May revision reflects the additional cap and trade auction proceeds that were generated in February. So these are above and beyond what our projections were in January. And the February cap and trade auction resulted in $410 million in additional revenues that were above January. Once you account for the continuous appropriations, there was an additional $120 million of discretionary revenues that were available for May revision. And as I think Secretary Blumenfeld mentioned, we're proposing $100 million for the methane satellites initiative and an additional $20 million to support AB 617 programs that benefit disadvantaged communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. We have another question, if you can take this one as well. Can you clarify what would be accelerated in the ZEV package?
Yes, I'm gonna have my colleague Sergio Aguilar talk to that. One moment, please.
Yeah, so in March, the governor had initially announced an acceleration package for ZEV, which primarily included various investments across passenger vehicles and infrastructure, and also community-based options. And so the May revision continues that acceleration that was identified in March, but then in addition to that, also accelerates various investments across ZEV drayage trucks and infrastructure grants, transit buses and infrastructure grants, ZEV school buses, and then clean trucks and buses. So there's an additional acceleration for now, what is a total acceleration of about $2.3 billion.
Thank you, Sergio. And Matt, appreciate the responses. We're going to switch over to another question that we received around an inquiry on sea level rise adaptation. There's a question around what funds would be directed toward sea level rise adaptation. And there's a mention of the January budget investments. Secretary Crowfoot, over to you.
Yeah, so in this summary that we provided, we really highlighted where we're augmenting the January proposal, given the adjusted revenues of the here in this May revision. So in January, as I recall, $400 million was focused toward, I believe it was coastal wetland restoration, sea level rise. Those types of investments that were articulated in January are not going away. They're being, augmented by other investments. Much of the sort of the plus up or increased investments as it relates to climate resilience in the May revise are really focused on drought and wildfire as well, just given the intensifying drought that we find ourselves in. So we're excited to continue to be proposing and discussing with the legislature those investments on sea level rise that we made in January.
Thank you, Secretary Crowfoot. Another question for you all regarding 30 by 30 and an inquiry into how 30 by 30 will support restoration in wetlands.
Yeah, I'm glad to take this. So as you may know, if you follow 30 by 30, we launched our strategy on Earth Day with the governor, and it calls for 10 specific pathways, essentially focused on these sort of voluntary actions to conserve more lands. And so some of the funding that we're proposing, for example, for acquisitions of conserved lands, for easements on private lands that ensures environmental conservation, those are all going to advance 30 by 30, as is wetland restoration. Wetland restoration is really important right now, particularly inland wetland restoration for fish and for our salmon and other species that are really challenged during this drought, but also our wildlife, including our birds. And so we think significant investments, we think an unprecedented amount of investments that we're proposing between January and May in wetland restoration is going to advance all of our key priorities on biodiversity and recovering fish species and taking care of fish and wildlife and advancing 30 by 30. So we're really excited about those proposed investments.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And our Department of Finance colleagues remind us that all of the May revision items are in addition to the January 10th proposals. And again, you can view that budget and the revise at the governor's website. We put it into the chat a little earlier. So we have another question in a few more minutes for just a few around the May revise using climate-related measures in the January budget, and is that the same or significant, and in particular with regard to idle or orphan well remediation and funds? Secretary Crowfoot, perhaps you can address the investments from the budget into orphan well remediation.
Yeah, I'm not exactly tracking the details of that question, but I will say, we are excited that the state is proposing to fund, I believe it's $200 million in safely and permanently sealing wells that essentially are orphaned in that they don't have a responsible party anymore. And so our entity that oversees oil and gas, called CalGEM, is focused on prioritizing which are the most dangerous orphan wells that pose threats to communities. And then if we receive this funding, focused on sealing those wells. We're also excited, thanks to Senator Padilla and others at the federal level, that we are getting federal funding on that. So we're hopeful with the legislature's agreement that we'll have more funding than we've ever had before for safely and permanently sealing defunct wells. While I have the mic, I might just answer one question about this California Climate Information System, or CalCIS. Someone asked, is it redundant to CalAdapt or the state's scientific climate assessment? And I would explain that no, it's not. CalAdapt is a really good platform or website that helps us understand what climate impacts we'll be experiencing based on where we are in the state. And then our scientific climate assessment funds some real groundbreaking research from scientists across California about the impacts of climate change. This CalCIS is for the first time ever, going to be capturing real-time information across the state on data like the carbon sequestration of our landscapes, the moisture content in our plants. Believe it or not, even the presence of invasive species of plants across our landscapes. CalAdapt is really good about helping people understand what threats they're going to face. Our scientific assessment is really good about doing deep dive research every handful of years. But this CalCIS, if it's funded, is really going to provide that real-time public dashboard of climate impacts. And we're hopeful, as Jared mentioned, if the methane satellite and its technology is funded, that also that platform is going to include information about methane releases as well. We think it's going to be a really critical tool to manage accelerating climate change in the coming decades.
Thank you, Secretary Crowfoot. We have time for just one last question, and this question is around clarifications of funding that support environmental justice and equity, or climate justice that might be in alignment with the Federal Justice 40 initiative that was recently launched by the Biden administration. Perhaps Secretary Blumenfeld and Crowfoot can reply.
Thanks, Andrea, and Lauren, definitely chime in on this one. So California actually led the way, and really appreciate the question, because I think it kind of focuses on the most important thing about this budget, which is making sure that funds go to communities that need the help the most. So California's requirement was that 35% of GGRF revenue go to disadvantaged communities. Two important things about that. One is we actually have a really amazing mapping tool in California that many of you may know called CalEnviroscreen. It's in its 4th iteration. And secondly, there's a designation that's done called the Disadvantaged Communities Designation, which for the first time brought in tribes and property that is under the control of tribes into that disadvantaged designation. And so the GGRF, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund revenue is north of 50% right now. So we're really the model, I think, that can help the federal government with the Justice 40 initiative. One, work out what the criteria are, which I think is incredibly important to make sure that disadvantaged communities are covered. And then secondly, to make sure that we're really prioritizing that funding. So as a state, we're looking at how to do that more across the board, but really huge amount of great work that's happening in all the agencies to make that happen. And then I'll turn it over to Lauren to kind of wrap up this, but really that spirit of making sure that the programs are designed and targeted for low-income communities of color in California is not an art. It's really a science of knowing where those communities are, what kind of help they need, and making sure that it's as easy as possible to apply that money. So I'll leave it to you, Lauren, to finish up that question.
I think you covered it, Secretary Blumenfeld, perfectly. Thank you so much. And I feel like it's a great question to end on, because as all three of us have mentioned, leading with equity first and foremost and embedding it throughout each of the packages you see in the overarching climate budget was definitely a goal shared by the governor and across the administration. So with that, just want to thank you all again for your time and engagement and great questions. Now we have an exciting session ahead of us and discussions with the legislature and continued partnership with you all. But hope everyone is feeling hopeful on this exciting day of California's climate history.
Thanks so much, Lauren. I might just make one last reminder that if folks want to do a deeper dive on energy or water, there's an opportunity to do that deep dive with a group of us from the state. And I believe Andrea has put in the link the chat, those links to the Zoom discussions that are taking place at 3 o'clock, just in 10 minutes.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, Wade.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.